Hey there. I'm going to spend some time today talking about the formal aspects of Nigeria's regime, and as we usually do, I'm going to start with the constitution. Nigeria, much unlike Mexico, has been through 6 iterations of its constitution since achieving independence in 1960, and I am not going to walk you through the details of each and every one of those documents, but there are a few major shifts that it's helpful to know about and to try and connect to your understanding of Nigerian history. So the British initially leave Nigeria in 1960 at independence with a constitution that they have drafted and that imitates a number of British political institutions. So at the start of its period of independence, Nigeria is a constitutional monarchy. Its constitution recognizes Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state. That provision is pretty quickly discarded in subsequent constitutions. Nigeria becomes a fully independent republic without even that kind of nominal or titular or symbolic role for the Queen of England, and that remains the case today. Number two, the British set up Nigeria with a parliamentary system of government in which the legislature and the executive have essentially the same base of power. But the subsequent constitutions was shifted over to a presidential system where the legislature and the president are separately elected and you have the possibility of divided government. One thing that's in some flux is the federal versus unitary dilemma. The British have set up Nigeria, even in the colonial period, as something like a federal state. They had pretty substantially separate administrations, particularly in the north versus the south of Nigeria. And so the original 1960 constitution maintained that federal structure. Under military rule, you'll remember Nigeria goes into 2 long periods of military rule in the second half of the 20th century. And a number of those military rulers, starting in 1966, suspend aspects of federalism, basically saying we need to have unified national control, particularly in times of war or political crisis. So you see during periods of military rule a stronger centralization of authority. But in the current iteration of the Constitution, which went into place in 1999, we've gone back to a federal republic. The number of states in Nigeria has increased over time. Currently, there are 36 plus Abuja, the capital, which is its own slightly different entity. The present Constitution, which went into effect in 1999, creates a federal state. It is a presidential system, and it is a republic with no role for symbolic monarchy. On paper, Nigeria's constitution lays out all the groundwork that you could possibly need for a multi-party, competitive, free and fair democracy. And so the question for Nigeria and for evaluating exactly how democratic this country is less about the way that the rules are written and more about the ways that political actors do or don't follow the rules, the ways that people's actual behavior conforms to the rules and conforms to the norms that are laid out in this constitution. And that's something to pay attention to as we get into actual political behavior in Nigeria. So I'm going to walk you through now the formal elements of power as laid out in the Constitution, and we will start with the executive. The president is both the head of state and the head of government. Currently, the president, as of this recording, is Muhammadu Buhari, who is actually a former military ruler who was then elected as president in his own right in the Fourth Republic. And everything I tell you about the president's responsibilities in Nigeria should sound super familiar if you remember the basic outlines of the president's powers in Mexico, or for that matter, if you know about the powers of the president in the United States. This is kind of a textbook presidential system, and so you should not hear a lot of surprises in the formal powers of the president. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military in Nigeria. They are the head of the civil service, of the bureaucracy. They set the foreign policy agenda. That's in their capacity as the head of state. And then, of course, they approve legislation, which has been passed by the bicameral legislature, which we will get to in a second. Nigeria's cabinet is called the Federal Executive Council. Its members are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. One thing that is unique to Nigeria is something called the federal character principle. I'm going to tell you now, and you are going to get sick by the end of this unit of me saying that the fundamental thing you need to understand in Nigeria is that everything is about social cleavages, and there's a lot of different features of the regime that you can see are designed to try and mitigate the destabilizing effects of social cleavages, and the federal character principle is one of those. This is a provision written into the Constitution which requires that every state in Nigeria be represented in the cabinet and in the civil service, meaning you have to have a cabinet level minister for each of Nigeria's 36 states. And in the vast bureaucracy that Nigeria maintains, you have to have proportional representation of people whose origins are in each of those states. The goal here is that states, because ethnic groups in Nigeria tend to be concentrated in specific regions, giving people jobs on the basis of their origin by state essentially is a proxy for making sure that the civil service and the cabinet are ethnically diverse. So the goal is to make sure that every ethnic group in Nigeria is represented in approximate proportion to its share of the population. The downside, of course, is that there is more potential for corruption, and hiring is going to become less competitive and potentially less meritocratic as a result of this. There are a couple of other places in Nigeria's regime where you see that same kind of attempt to distribute jobs or distribute patronage across different ethnic groups, often using states as a proxy. It is worth noting, by the way, because this is a mistake my students commonly make, the federal character principle doesn't require distribution of jobs by ethnic group. It uses states as a proxy for ethnic group, because you can kind of imagine why it might be potentially problematic to say, well, we have to have X percentage of jobs go to Igbo people. Let's move on to the legislature. It's called the National Assembly. It is bicameral, two chambers. Should be unsurprising for anybody in the United States. The lower chamber is called the House of Representatives, has 360 seats. The upper chamber is called the Senate. There are 109 seats. The legislature's powers, again, should seem pretty familiar if you've thought about Mexico, if you've thought about any other presidential system. The legislature can debate and pass laws. That's what legislatures do. They do have the power to impeach the president or the vice president. The Senate also has unique powers to confirm nominees to the cabinet and to the judiciary. And we'll talk a little bit about specifically the Supreme Court nomination process a little bit later. Worth noting, the legislature in the Fourth Republic has not operated as a particularly powerful body for originating legislation or for resisting the agenda of the president. I don't think that in this period we've had divided government in Nigeria. And in practice, most legislation originates with the president and the cabinet, as opposed to coming from individual members of or committees in the National Assembly. That situation might be changing a little bit. There's some political commentators who are starting to say that the legislature is asserting a little bit more independence, but too soon to say, I think, whether that trend has definitively shifted. The major policymaking center is still in the executive branch. Moving to the judiciary. So the legacy of British colonialism is important here in explaining some things about how Nigeria's judicial system works, and there are two specific colonial legacies that I want to mention here. Number one is the system of common law. This is the legal system that operates in Britain and also in a lot of former British colonies and a lot of English-speaking countries around the world. The judiciary relies on the system of common law, which depends on precedent. It depends on, that is to say, previous opinions of courts and judges, and it also depends to some degree on tradition. This system gives a fair degree of independence to judges in interpreting law and saying what the law means. It contrasts with a system that's more common in, for instance, continental Europe called civil law or code law, where legislators write much more detailed statutes, and the role of judges is much more about fact-finding as opposed to legal interpretation. So that legacy of common law remains an important feature of Nigeria's judicial system post-independence. The other thing that the British start and the current Nigerian government keeps is that when the British show up and colonize Nigeria, there's a bunch of different traditional laws, some of which are influenced by religious beliefs, some of which are influenced by previous local customs. And that's going to vary from region to region, from religion to religion, from ethnic group to ethnic group. And the British leave a fair number of those traditional laws in place. As a general rule, it's often easier, lower impact for a colonizing power to rule through local elites and existing traditions, existing legal systems, than it is for them to try and sweep the table clean and impose their own legal system. And so the British, when they're ruling as a colonizing power, kind of delegate or hand off some number of legal activities, particularly involving family law, to these different traditional legal structures. And the Nigerian system incorporates that today. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. One historical thing worth noting is that in 1994, remember, we're still in the period of military rule under a particularly brutal dictator named Sani Abacha. In 1994, there's a protest movement in the Niger Delta region where the Niger River empties into the Atlantic Ocean. And there's an ethnic group there called the Ogoni people who were particularly negatively impacted by oil production. Most of Nigeria's oil reserves are located in the Niger Delta region. And this guy named Ken Saro-Wiwa is is the leader of a civil society group called MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, which is an ethnically based nonviolent movement that calls for stricter regulations on oil extraction in the Niger Delta and more sharing of the revenues from oil extraction with the people who are most directly impacted by the oil industry. And so his activism is a significant pain in the butt for the Abacha regime, which is having its legitimacy questioned by its own people. And Sani Abacha orders the execution, or rather gets the judiciary to order the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists in 1994. That's regarded as a pretty significant breach of judicial independence. The widespread perception, particularly by the international community, is that this judicial decision happened under pressure from the Abacha government and reflected less an attempt, to enforce Nigeria's laws than it did to use the judiciary to try and eliminate a political problem for Abacha. This is one of the reasons why Nigeria actually is pushed to democratize in 1999, because there's a significant international blowback from that decision. So judicial independence is obviously a serious concern. It is not a particularly strong feature of the military regime, as is true across many military regimes. And so one thing to think about when we're looking at the judiciary in Nigeria's present-day constitution is protections for judicial independence. One of those is the power of judicial review, which does rest in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can strike down laws that it deems unconstitutional and other government actions as well. One other protection is something called the National Judicial Council, which is an institution that's created in 1999 with that new constitution, with the start of the Fourth Republic, whose function is to recommend judges for the president to nominate. And the theory there is that the National Judicial Council is going to make nonpartisan, non-political recommendations for judges, so that the president can't just hand out judgeships to people that they feel are going to be the most supportive, or are going to, it would be nice if this guy owed me a favor because I just made him a justice on the Supreme Court. The idea is to eliminate those possibilities of corruption. The National Judicial Council's website puts it much better, which is that it exists, quote, in order to insulate the judiciary from the whims and caprices of the executive. That is delightful, and I love it. The people who sit there are mostly lawyers and judges, plus there's a couple other non-lawyers on that council. One last thing that's unique to Nigeria. In keeping with that British custom of leaving some degree of traditional customary law in place at the local level, Nigerian states under the Constitution can authorize what are known as traditional subsidiary courts, which is to say, if there has been a legal system in place based on the traditions or the religious customs of a region, states can decide that they want to create courts that use those legal traditions instead of Nigerian law to resolve disputes between people. In theory, both parties in a proceeding must consent to participate. So if you want to divorce me under the laws of a Sharia court, but I don't want to divorce you under the laws of Sharia court, in theory, you can't do that. We have to go into the conventional court. Although in practice, sometimes in some regions, it's more difficult to access the state court than it is to access the traditional court. The most sort of high-profile and controversial implementation of this principle is the implementation of Sharia courts, which decide cases based on Islamic law in 12 northern, predominantly Muslim states in Nigeria. And the Constitution also provides for Sharia and customary courts of appeal. So if you have had a case that doesn't go your way in one of these traditional subsidiary courts, you could actually appeal it up at the national level. So that's another accommodation that Nigeria's regime makes to those many, many social cleavages that could potentially destabilize the country. Next thing to talk about is elections in Nigeria. And actually the background image that you're looking at, although you can't see the whole thing, depicts a bunch of Nigerians lining up and showing their national ID cards in order to cast a ballot at a national election. Couple distinctive election rules. If you're making comparisons to Mexico, particularly thinking about the election of the president, Nigeria's rules are a lot more complicated. The threshold to get elected president is a good deal higher. So in order to get elected president, you have a direct national vote. The president serves 4-year terms, and they can serve a maximum of 2 terms as president. So that's a little longer limit than Mexico total. The president is directly elected by the people, but unlike in Mexico, they need to get a majority of the national vote. They need to get 50% plus 1 of all votes cast. And in principle, if nobody meets that threshold, then they have a rerun. The other thing that's unique to Nigeria is something called the distribution requirement. And this is similar to the federal character principle in attempting to make sure that any national administration is going to have a broad base of support from many regions and therefore many different ethnic and religious groups. The distribution requirement says that in order to be president, you have to win at least a quarter of the votes in at least two-thirds of the states. So in other words, you can't have like a massive like 95% vote share in some of the states, but then be wildly unpopular in half of the states. The distribution requirement forces essentially presidential candidates to go campaign and build support around the country. And again, here states are a good proxy for religion and ethnicity. And so the real purpose here is to make sure that no presidential candidate is winning support from just one ethnic group. One last thing, not a rule, but a norm. And you're going to hear me say that like 15 times because people really frequently lose points on my tests for saying that a rule in Nigerian elections is zoning. But it's not a rule, it's a norm. Zoning is the idea that presidential candidates, the nominees for president from any given major party, should alternate between the North and the South. And in this case, that's a proxy for, as well as ethnicity, religion. Usually when you nominate a Northern candidate, you're nominating a Muslim. When you nominate a Southern candidate, you're nominating a Christian. This is established under a party called the People's Democratic Party, which holds the presidency from 1999 up through 2015. And the PDP just kind of decides on its own that it's going to alternate nominating candidates from North and South, essentially in order to try and establish itself as a national party, in order to avoid, if they nominate a Southern candidate, they want to have this kind of promise to their Northern supporters that your turn will be next, in order to avoid alienating those people and having them run off and form a different party and support a different candidate. The PDP is no longer in power. The current party that dominates the presidency and the legislature is called the APC, the All Progressives Congress. But so far, both of these major parties, have stuck to this norm of zoning in an attempt to make Nigeria's elections something other than a contest between North and South, Muslim and Christian. That broke down when Goodluck Jonathan decided he was going to run for a term as president in 2011. We've talked about that before, and we will talk about that again. So we'll come back to that, to what happens when zoning goes away. Elections for the legislature. So legislators in both the House and Senate serve 4-year terms. There are no term limits for legislators in Nigeria. In the House, Nigeria actually has like the simplest legislative electoral system of, I think, any of our case study countries. In both cases, it's single-member district plurality. For the House, the country is divided up into districts of roughly equal population. Each of them elects candidates by single-member district plurality. For the Senate, each state is divided up into 3 districts, and then Abuja, the capital, gets 1 district in the Senate. That's how you get 109 people in the Senate. And so if you were a senator in Nigeria, you represent essentially 1/3 of your state delineated geographically. And again, you're elected by plurality. As is the case in Mexico, Nigeria, in its process of democratization, created an independent body called the INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission. Somewhere on the internet, they actually have, I think, a music video promoting themselves called "Don't Sell Your Vote." Highly recommend that you look it up. I'll throw it in the links for this, in the comments for this video if I remember. Really great A+ video. INEC is established in the 1999 Constitution, and its goal, as is the case in Mexico, is to oversee free and fair elections that are independent from political pressure from whoever happens to hold the president's office at the time of the election. So INEC is financially independent. It has a guaranteed budget. It's generally pretty popular. It's pretty highly regarded. And even elites in Nigeria who benefited under the previous undemocratic regime tend to support INEC because it lends an aura of legitimacy, right? If people think that their elections are free and fair, it is a good thing if they believe that that if those elections are being administered by a relatively independent and trusted body. On the other hand, the chair of INEC and its commissioners are still appointed by the president. At the state level, commissioners for the Electoral Commission are appointed by governors. So it's not entirely independent of political influence, but this is actually one of the more trusted bodies in Nigeria. We'll probably talk in class about some significant problems with Nigeria's elections. These are by no means exemplary free and fair elections, but INEC, I think, has contributed to pretty significant progress in the democratization of Nigeria in the last 20 plus years. Moving down to the level of local government, and a reminder here that Nigeria is a federal system. Couple of reasons why I think personally that having a federal rather than a unitary system makes sense for the particular situation in Nigeria. Reason number one is that remember, Nigeria, the country of Nigeria, is a British colonial creation. There is no single pre existing political entity with roughly similar borders that goes back before colonialism. And so I think it makes sense to recognize that long history of regional political independence rather than trying to mash every region together into a unitary government. Second, maybe most importantly, is the existence of regional social cleavages, which, as we've said, tend to line up with other cleavages of ethnicity and religion and language. And so it probably makes sense to distribute some degree of policymaking power to those localities so that you don't have every single issue turning into, for instance, a Muslim versus Christian fight. Third is, as we've said before, the legacy of colonialism. The British administered Nigeria as essentially for a long time two separate protectorates in the north and the south. They tended to grant a greater degree of independence in the north. They tended to be more interventionist in the south because when the British showed up, there's more independent and more unified political governance in the north already. And so that legacy is another reason why the British, as I've said, left Nigeria with a federal constitution. As is the case in Mexico, one potentially compromising factor to the independence of local government in Nigeria is that states are almost completely dependent on the federal government for revenue. The federal government controls the oil in Nigeria. Oil revenue flows to the federal government, and then that distributes it back to the states. And so, except for Lagos, which is the big commercial center in Nigeria, Nigerian states tend to be dependent on oil handouts from the federal governments for their money, which of course limits their independence in policymaking. The mathematical equation by which oil revenue is handed out to the states is called the derivation formula, and that's a really sticky thing in Nigerian politics because it's so influential in terms of what state and local officials can do, because that's the primary source of their money. The derivation formula is designed to try and do two things, which are essentially in tension with each other. One is to distribute more money to the areas of Nigeria that are least economically developed, which tend to be in the north away from the oil. The other is to compensate the oil-producing regions, primarily in the Niger Delta in the south, for the economic and environmental impacts of oil production in their region. And so this is the source of a lot of political fights in Nigeria. One last thing to note is that there are no local or state police in Nigeria. All of the security services are under the control of the federal government. And that's another feature that compromises the independence of local government, that makes federalism in Nigeria little less rigorous in terms of protecting local government powers than it is in, say, the United States. Okay. Last institution to talk about for today, and I haven't talked about this for our other case study countries, but it is really important in Nigeria's history, and that's the military. So, as you probably know by now, Nigeria underwent periods of military rule from 1966 to 76, and then again from 1983 to 99. So, democracy, again, is relatively recent and relatively tenuous in Nigeria. It is by no means the only type of regime that's existed in Nigeria since independence. So we need to think a little bit about the role of the military in Nigerian politics and the potential that that military rule will happen again. It's worth noting that the military is perhaps Nigeria's only truly national institution. Remember, this is a country with a long history of local political independence and a lot of regional social cleavages. And the military is one of the few institutions in Nigeria, both in the period of British rule and after, that incorporates people from all around the country, from different religions, different regions, different ethnic groups, and offers them possibilities for social mobility. And in particular, in the 1960s, the military is a really important route for social mobility for people from the north, which is relatively poorer, which has fewer economic opportunities. The military is often seen as a way out and up. So the military, this helps explain why the military might actually have been a relatively effective unifying force during these periods of military rule. But ultimately, the military steps down from power in 1999, supervises a transition to democracy. And an interesting question to consider is why, for the last 22 years and counting, military rule hasn't yet resumed. Couple of reasons why. Number one, Under the first presidency of the First Republic, under Olusegun Obasanjo, officers in the military who had political experience, who had been employees in the previous military governments, were required to retire. And so that potentially removed a number of the people who saw themselves as, would-be governors or would-be legislators or would-be presidents. They were required to exit the military. That's a valuable protective measure. Number two, similarly under Obasanjo, various military officers had acquired a bunch of assets corruptly or illegally, and many of those assets were seized under the new democratic regime after 1999. And so that removes some of the ability of military officers to, buy political support. Finally, more recently, Nigeria's military has been engaged in an ongoing and not entirely successful struggle against a terrorist group in the north called Boko Haram. And so the military's image, its public approval, has really suffered as a result of their inability to decisively deal with Boko Haram. And that might reduce public appetite for any kind of military government in the future, even in the face of failures or shortcomings of the civilian democratic government. I will leave it there, and I will just leave you with one big question to think about, which in many ways is kind of the big question for when we talk about Nigeria, which is, what are the elements of this regime that are designed to ensure stability despite the many social cleavages in this country? I will reiterate that social cleavages are the thing that you really need to think about when you're considering almost every aspect of Nigerian politics at the national level. And so one thing I'll urge you to spend a little time thinking about before I see you in class next is the ways in which the regime is designed to deal with that fundamental reality, and also whether you think those different adaptations are going to be successful or ultimately make the problem worse. That's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you.